After 14 years of running their front of house, my father-in-law handed my restaurant to his college roommate's daughter on a Tuesday afternoon like he was passing along a parking spot. She lasted 11 days before the chef walked out mid-service. I found out about it through a text from our head bartender, not from my husband, not from my father-in-law, not from anyone who owed me that much. Just a message from Tomas that said, "You see what's happening here," with a screenshot of the new manager's first staff memo attached. She'd spelled mise en place as mise en place and sent it to the entire team. That was how I learned my career was over. My father-in-law, I'll call him Big Al because everyone did, even people who were afraid of him, had built Caruso's from a 12-table Italian spot in downtown Columbus into something that actually mattered. White tablecloths. A wine list that took me 3 years to curate properly. Regulars who called ahead on their birthdays and asked for their usual table, their usual server, their usual bottle. We'd been written up in Columbus Monthly twice, once in Ohio Magazine, and a food journalist from the Chicago Tribune had stopped in unannounced the previous spring and written something that made Big Al cry in his office with the door closed, though he denied it afterward. I had run that floor for 14 years. Since I was 28 years old and newly married and desperate to prove I belonged somewhere that felt real. The woman who replaced me was 26. Her name was Blythe. She had a hospitality management degree from a school in Florida and had spent her entire professional life managing the dining room of a beachside brunch place that closed at 2 in the afternoon. Big Al called it a fresh perspective. My husband sat next to him at the table when he said it and studied the grain of the wood like it contained a message he'd been trying to decode for years. I signed the papers. I thanked them for the severance, 3 months, which was generous and also insulting in a way I couldn't fully articulate, and I went back to my office and sat in the chair I'd sat in for 14 years and looked at the walls. I had put up a corkboard the first year I worked there. Over time it had accumulated things. A photo from the night we hit our first 100 cover service, a note from a regular who'd come in for his anniversary every year for a decade and wanted me to know the night his wife died that she had chosen Caruso's because it was where she felt most at home. A drawing that Judge Perkins' granddaughter had made of the dining room from her booster seat when she was 4. She was 11 now. I'd watched her grow up across white tablecloths. I took the corkboard off the wall and put it in my trunk. Some things you don't leave behind. My own notebook, not the official reservation system, not the POS records, but my actual notebook, the one I'd been keeping since my second year, went into my purse. Black moleskine, thick with extra pages I'd taped in over the years. Every regular had a section, not just their reservation history, but the real information. Mr. and Mrs. Ferrer always needed the corner booth because she was hard of hearing, and the ambient noise elsewhere gave her headaches. Dr. Osi requested his chicken done without the lemon butter because of a sensitivity that wasn't quite an allergy but close enough. The Nakamura family, 3 generations, they came for every birthday, needed the kids' menu items available even when the grandchildren aged out of them, because the youngest had food anxieties and the familiarity helped. The judge was lactose intolerant but always forgot and ordered the risotto, so we made him a version with olive oil that tasted better anyway and he never needed to know. Blythe could have the dining room. She could have the wine list I'd built and the vendor relationships I'd cultivated and the reservation system with its years of history. She couldn't have the notebook. She appeared in my office doorway as I was taking down the last of my things. She was wearing a silk blouse that was wrong for restaurant work. You learn quickly what survives a service and what doesn't, and her smile had the quality of someone who had never had to work for a room's approval. "I'm so excited to connect with all your guests," she said. "I thought about the Nakamura family. I thought about Mrs. Ferreira and her corner booth. I thought about the judge and his risotto. They'll connect with you," I said, and I meant exactly what I said, though not the way she heard it. The first call came 9 days later. I was on my back porch drinking coffee when my phone buzzed. Mr. Ferreira's name on the screen. He was a retired federal judge, 73 years old, the kind of man who had called me exactly twice outside the restaurant in 14 years, once to tell me about his wife's stroke, once to thank me for the flowers I'd sent to the hospital. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said. "Never. How is she? How's Mrs. Ferreira?" "She's well, thank you for asking. I'm calling because, and I feel foolish. We had a reservation last Saturday and there was a bit of a situation." He told me carefully, the way lawyers tell difficult things, looking for the right words. They'd been seated at a table near the kitchen pass. He'd asked if they might move to their usual corner booth. The new manager, he called her the young woman, had told him that seating was optimized for the evening service flow and the corner booth was reserved for a party of 4. There was no party of 4, he said quietly. It sat empty the entire evening. Norma couldn't follow half the conversation. She was exhausted by the time we got home. I held the phone and looked at the oak tree in my neighbor's yard and tried to keep my voice level. I'm so sorry, Mr. Ferreira. She should have just been moved. I know you would have moved her. That's why I'm calling. I suppose I just needed someone to know. After I hung up, I sat for a long time. Then I went inside and opened my notebook to the Ferreira section and wrote down what he'd told me, the date and the table number and the empty corner booth, because old habits are hard to break and some records deserve to be kept. By the end of that first week, I had 4 more calls. Not because I'd asked for them, not because I'd announced some campaign of outreach, just because 14 years of actual relationships tend to generate actual feelings when they're disrupted. Dr. Osei's assistant called to say the doctor had ordered the special the previous Wednesday and received it with the lemon butter he couldn't have. Nobody had flagged his file. He hadn't said anything during service because he was a gracious man who disliked making scenes, but he'd been sick that night and he wasn't sure he'd be returning. Tomás texted me updates like dispatches from a war zone. She doesn't know the table numbers. She has a cheat sheet taped under the host stand. Then, told the Nakamura family, the kids' menu was for children 12 and under. 11-year-old cried. His mom asked for you. Then, on a Friday night, she tried to upsell the Garcias on a wine pairing. They've been coming here for 8 years. Jorge is a sommelier. I did not contact the restaurant. I did not call my father-in-law. I did not draft a triumphant email cataloging the disasters. Instead, I pulled out a box of note cards I'd bought years ago, cream with a simple border, nothing fancy, and I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote, not business correspondence, not professional networking, just notes. The kind that said I was thinking about you. The kind that mentioned things only I would remember to mention. To Mr. and Mrs. Ferreira, I wrote that I hoped the corner booth treated them well wherever life took them next, and that Mrs. Ferreira's laugh was one of the genuinely wonderful sounds in my life over the past decade. To Dr. Osei, I wrote that it had been a privilege to look out for him all these years, and that I hoped wherever he found himself dining next would take his health as seriously as I always tried to. To the Nakamura family, I wrote a longer note. I mentioned their youngest by name, Kenji, 8 years old, who liked to draw race cars on the paper tablecloth covers, and who once told me very seriously that my restaurant was his favorite place in the world, better than the zoo because the zoo smelled. I told them that watching that family grow over the years was one of the best things about my job, and that Kenji's opinion on dining establishments would always matter to me. My husband found me sealing the last envelope after dinner. Are those to the restaurant guests? He asked, the way you ask a question when you already know the answer and you're deciding how you feel about it. Just thank you notes, I said. To people who were kind to me, he was quiet for a moment. He'd been quiet in a lot of moments lately, the silences spreading between us like weather moving in. My dad might see this as you trying to. Your dad made a decision, I said. I'm allowed to say goodbye to people. He nodded slowly and went to bed and let myself feel the particular sadness of loving someone who watches you be wronged and calls it complicated. The notes went out the next morning. What came back took me by surprise, even though it shouldn't have. Mr. Ferreira called on a Wednesday. He said they'd decided to try a new Italian place that had opened near their house. He didn't sound guilty about it, just honest. It's not the same, he said, but Norma needs the right acoustics. You understand? Of course I do, I said, and I did. Dr. Osei's assistant called back 3 days later. He wanted me to thank you for the note, and to ask, this is a bit unusual, whether you do any consulting work? He sits on the board of a private dining club that's been having some service issues. I told him I was figuring out my next steps and I'd keep it in mind. The Nakamura call came on a Saturday morning. It was Kenji's mother, which I hadn't expected. She said Kenji had asked her to keep my note because he wanted to add it to his collection, which she explained was a shoebox under his bed where he kept things that mattered to him. Movie ticket, a birthday card from his grandfather, apparently my note. I had to put the phone down for a second after she told me that. She asked if I'd ever thought about private event planning. Her husband's company did a corporate dinner every January, 60 people, the kind of evening that needed someone who understood that client relationships were conducted over food and wine and the experience of feeling genuinely hosted. I said I was thinking about a lot of things. What I was actually doing in those weeks was not thinking. I was cooking. Not for anyone in particular, just for myself because cooking is how I process things that don't have obvious solutions. My father-in-law's disaster played out in Tomas's texts while I made stock from scratch on a Tuesday afternoon, watching it reduce slowly, skimming what rose to the surface. The Garcias didn't come back this week, he wrote. I skimmed. Jorge's brother has a restaurant in Dublin. Word travels. I turned the heat down. She submitted the wine order without cross-referencing the existing inventory. We have 11 cases of the same Barolo. I let the stock do what it needed to do. Then one Thursday evening, my phone rang with a number I recognized, even though I'd never expected to see it again. My mother-in-law. She never called me. Not because we were unfriendly, but because she was a careful woman who existed in the careful space between her husband and her son, and had learned long ago that expressing opinions had costs. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said. You're not. Is everything okay? A pause. Albert is having a difficult month. Albert. She only used his full name in serious moments. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, which was more truth than performance. He's not sleeping. He sits in his study at night. He won't say what's bothering him, but I know him. Another pause. The Nakamura reservation cancelled. I heard him on the phone. Her voice went quieter. 8, he said. 8 years. I didn't say anything. I thought you should know, she said, which was the most she could give me, and more than I expected. We said goodnight. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that, holding the phone against my chest, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, thinking about what it means to love people who have failed you. My husband came home that night carrying the particular weight of someone who had been trying to hold two things together that weren't naturally inclined to stay joined. My dad asked if you'd consider coming back, he said before he'd even put down his bag. Not as the manager. He's talking about a consulting arrangement, senior advisor for guest experience, he's calling it. What does that mean? It means he wants your knowledge without having to admit he made a mistake. I thought that was surprisingly perceptive of him, and I told him so. He sat down at the kitchen table, which was unusual. He usually ate standing up on busy nights or in front of his laptop. He sat down like someone who intended to stay. I should have said something, he said. When he first brought it up, I knew for about 3 weeks before he told you. I know you did. I told myself it wasn't my decision to interfere with. His business, his call. I know you did. That was wrong. He said it simply, without the elaborate scaffolding people usually build around apologies, and I appreciated that. I watched it happen, and I didn't warn you, and that was wrong. I let the words sit in the room for a while. He deserved that, not as punishment, but as respect. For the admission, for the plainness of it. I'm not going back to Caruso's, I said finally. Okay, but I'm not done working. I'm figuring something out, and I need you to be on the side of what I'm figuring out, not on the side of what's convenient for your father. Okay, he said again, and this time it meant something different. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in November, while I was testing a new gnocchi recipe and had flour on my hands and wasn't going to answer until I saw it was Dr. Osi's number directly, not his assistant's. I hope this isn't too forward, he said, after we'd exchanged pleasantries. But I mentioned your name to some people. The club I sit on the board of, they're looking for someone to oversee the dining program. It's not a front-of-house management position exactly. It's more like they want someone who understands that members of a private club want to feel remembered, known. He paused. You made me feel known for 8 years. Even my allergy. Especially my allergy, actually, since I never had to bring it up. I wiped the flour off my hands with a dish towel and sat down at the kitchen table. Tell me more about what they're looking at, I said. It was a private dining club, 20-year-old institution, 200 members, the kind of place where people celebrated retirements and anniversaries, and the kinds of dinners that needed to feel like events rather than meals. They'd been running on autopilot for years, and the membership was getting restless. They didn't need a manager, exactly. They needed someone who could look at the way they operated and rebuild the connective tissue between the staff and the people they were supposed to be serving. I opened my Moleskine to a blank page and started writing. By the time I had my first meeting with the club's board in December, I had 3 pages of notes and a proposal that was less about systems and more about philosophy. The idea that hospitality wasn't a service industry skill set but a way of seeing people, and that it could be taught if you hired for curiosity and empathy rather than just technical efficiency. Mr. Ferreira agreed to serve as a reference. He sent a letter that I was not supposed to read but that his wife described to me over the phone as the most thorough recommendation Albert has written since his clerking days, and he takes those very seriously. The Nakamura family's father sent an email to the club's board directly, unsolicited. He didn't tell me he was going to do it. I only found out because the board chair mentioned it at our second meeting, looking slightly surprised that someone would take the initiative without being asked. "What did it say?" I asked. "It said you remembered his son's name across 8 years of visits, and that his son keeps your note in a shoebox because he considers it meaningful correspondence." The board chair paused. "He said if we didn't hire you, he was going to be very annoyed with us at the next board dinner." I got the contract in January. It was not the same as running Caruso's. It was quieter, more methodical, less of the adrenaline that comes with a full dining room at peak service on a Saturday night. But it was mine in a way that Caruso's, I realized, had never fully been. I had built it for someone else and taken pride in that, and there was nothing wrong with that, but this was different. I hired Tomas away from Caruso's 3 months later. He didn't require much persuading. My father-in-law called me on a shunnet afternoon in February. He called my cell, not my husband's, which meant he'd had to make a decision about doing so. "I hear you've taken on a new project," he said. "I have. Is it going well?" "It's going very well." A long pause, the kind he used when he was navigating towards something he didn't know how to say directly. "Blythe gave notice last week," he said. I think she was relieved. "I'm sorry to hear that." "No, you're not," he said, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice had something human in it. "No," I agreed, "but I'm not happy about it either." She was put in a position she wasn't ready for, I know. The words came out like something heavy being put down. I know that now. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular, his wife's garden, the winter they'd been having, whether the restaurant would be okay. He didn't ask me to come back and I didn't offer. We both understood that the thing that had been broken wasn't the kind that gets repaired by going back to how it was. When I hung up, I went and stood in my due office, a small room at the club with a window that looked out onto the garden courtyard, and I opened my Moleskine and I added a note at the bottom of the page I'd been keeping. February. The call came. He said he knows. I closed the notebook and looked out at the courtyard. The garden was bare in the winter light, the beds turned over and waiting, but you could see the shape of what it would be in spring, the bones of it. The care someone had put into designing something meant to come back year after year. That was the work. Not the title, not the building, not whose name was on the reservation system. The work was remembering. The work was the notebook and the note cards and knowing that Kenji Nakamura keeps meaningful things in a shoebox, and that Mrs. Ferreira needs the corner booth, and that what people want when they sit down at a table isn't really food. It's to feel like someone expected them. Someone was glad they came. I had known how to do that for 20 years. Nobody could restructure that away. Nobody could hire someone younger to do it instead. You either saw people, really saw them, or you didn't, and no amount of hospitality training could teach a person to care. I turned back to a fresh page and started writing. There was so much still to remember.